Hello friends, my name's Ty and I'm going to read to you. Tonight's selection is a story called Hail to the King. I figured this is one of my favorite stories that I've ever written because I had a really good time writing it and I think it's funny anyway. And it's the last video I'm going to make for 2023, so we'll be moving on to different stuff in the new year. So here we go. Is everything ready? Jack asked as he slammed the basement door behind him and moved into the musty room. He had a school backpack tucked under one arm and he set it on the floor. Just about, Dave said, as he and Tim finished pushing the old couch out of the middle of the floor and against the wall. Crouching, Dave produced a folding knife from his pocket, flipped open the blade, and began cutting a hole in the old shag carpet to reveal the concrete beneath. Are you sure you should be doing that? Tim asked, wringing his hands. Dave made a pff sound. We'll put the couch back when we're done. My mother will never notice. Besides, Jack said, if this actually works, the whole world will be too busy talking about how awesome we are to worry about a hole in the carpet of a shitty house. Dave looked up at him with a scowl, and Jack had the good grace to look sheepish. No offense. Dave made a growling noise and continued cutting. Jack knelt beside his backpack and began pulling out books and black and white photos that looked like they'd been produced by a low-quality printer. I got everything I could find on him. Historical texts, novels, comic books, images from Google, everything. La Morte d'Arthur, Tim read from the cover of one of the books, then flipped it over and looked at the back. This is a library book, Jack. Did you check it out properly? Jack looked up at him like he'd grown a second head. I'm pretty sure they won't want it by the time we're done with this. He looked down and continued to rifle through the bag. Like Regan always tells us, magic can be messy. Tim put the book down and started wringing his hands again. I have a bad feeling about this. Fuck your feelings, Dave said as he cut the last corner of a large square of carpet and tossed it on the couch. This is going to be epic. Okay, Jack said, standing and dusting his hands together. Do you have the other book? You bet your ass I do, Dave said. He put his pocket knife away and went to the back of the room, where a dusty wet bar, complete with old beer mirrors and bar stools, stood in the corner. He crouched out of sight for a moment, and Tim and Jack heard a great deal of scraping, a muttered curse, and a large bang. Then Dave popped back up, a large leather-bound book held above his head. Got it. He came back over to the square of missing carpet, nearly bouncing in his excitement. The book was as wide as a chemistry textbook, and as thick and heavy as a brick. The front cover had a bronze Celtic shield knot, but no other markings. Dave set the book on the floor and opened it to a page marked with a broad red ribbon. I'm pretty sure this is it, Dave said, tapping the page. Pretty sure? Tim and Jack said in unison. You know this is summoning magic, right? Tim asked. Yeah, if we fuck this up, we might have Mephistopheles standing in your mother's basement, Jack said. Dave made the pff sound again. No, this is it. Get the chalk. Jack reached into the bag to produce a leather pouch, which he carefully opened to reveal a piece of yellow chalk. Jesus, Tim said. Is that Regan's chalk? He told us how valuable that is. Yeah, Jack said as he reverently pulled the length of chalk from the pouch and held it up. That's because it's made with gold and real human bone. He smiled at Tim's nervous grimace. It's the only way to draw a summoning circle. Kneeling on the square of bare floor and referring to the open book, Jack drew a circle that filled the open square. Within the circle, he began copying runes from the page. Say the words, boys, Jack said as he worked, little beads of sweat popping out in his smooth upper lip. This won't work if you don't say the words. In as deep a voice as they could each manage, they began reciting the chant that Regan had taught them. Once the runes were complete, Jack held out his hand. Now the books. Still chanting, they passed the books to him, one by one. La Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory, The Once and Future King by T.H. White, The Mists of Avalon by Marion Bradley, The Eagle's Brood by Jack White, and half a dozen others. Jack stacked them in the center of the circle, and on top of the pile he placed several images, some photographs of actors, other cartoonish drawings. Each showed King Arthur in various depictions, from plausible historical renderings of what he might have looked like in the 4th century, to the typical knight in shining armor from the movies. Now, for the final thing, Jack said, and held out his hand to Dave, who slapped his knife into it. Jack unfolded the blade and gave his thumb a quick poke. A thick bead of blood welled up, and he held it over the topmost picture, which showed Arthur dressed in full plate armor holding a sword. A fat drop splashed on Arthur's face. After a moment, the blood began to glow. Jack stepped back beside Tim and gripped his hand. He in turn gripped Dave's hand. They continued the chant in an arcane language of the old magic, their voices getting louder. The glow from the blood grew brighter, and it seemed that their voices filled the basement with a booming echo. Each of the boys felt a slight breeze on his face, which soon turned into a wind. That wind grew into a storming roar that snatched at their clothes and threatened to push them off their feet. Inside the summoning circle was dead still, the paper pictures not stirring at all, but the red glow from the drop of Jack's blood had turned to a fiercely bright light that hurt to look at. Their eyes shut tight, and leaning into the wind, the boys gripped each other's hands and continued to chant. Suddenly there was an explosive boom from within the summoning circle, and a hot blast hurled the boys back. They lay for several moments, searching around them for their wits. Slowly, they each sat up. In the circle stood Arthur, the sword Excalibur drawn and held point down towards the floor. He looked at each of the boys in turn. "Hail to the king," Jack said, pushing himself to his feet. "I can't believe that fucking worked," Dave said. "What?" Tim said, digging in his ear with his finger. All he could hear was a long whine. Jack brought his feet together and made what he hoped was a formal bow. "My king, Lord, Majesty? Welcome to, Dave's basement." He made a broad gesture that encompassed the room, which was barely recognizable. The basement was a shambles. The windows were all shattered, the mirrors behind the bar had been knocked to the floor and broken, and the ceiling above Arthur was scorched black. "Your mom is definitely going to notice this," Tim said, taking in the devastation. "Not more than she notices him," Dave said, tilting his chin towards Arthur, who still hadn't spoken. He was a giant, at least a foot taller than any of the boys, and as wide as a football linebacker. His blue eyes kept moving, landing on each of them, and then scanning the room. Jack, who seemed to be the de facto spokesman, cleared his throat, then dug briefly in his ear. "So, my, Lord, we called upon you because the world is kind of fucked," Dave finished for him. "Yeah, fucked," Jack said, nodding. "The legends we read all said that in our time of greatest need, you would come back and put the wrong things right. And, stop the bad guys," Tim said. "And, do, battle," Dave said. "Right," Tim said. "Do battle with the forces of darkness." At the word battle, Arthur's eyes lit up. "Battle?" he asked. His voice was deep, musical. He sounded like a baritone opera singer who was on the verge of letting loose a big note. He tilted his head back and laughed, a sound even more musical than his speech, then lifted his sword above his head, punching through the ceiling as though it weren't there. "Battle!" The sound of his shout was painful on the ears, even after the cacophony of the storm that had summoned him, and the boys clapped their hands to the sides of their heads. "To battle!" Arthur shouted. He looked about until he saw the door, and then shouted, "Aha!" and strode towards it. He ducked, both to keep his head from hitting the top of the frame and to lay his shoulder into the door, sending it rocketing out into Dave's backyard. "Think your mom will notice that?" Tim asked. He'd stopped wringing his hands, so that was something. Jack turned to Dave. "What the fuck is wrong with him?" Dave shrugged. "How should I know?" "Jesus," Jack said. "Come on." Tim crouched down to grab Regan's stolen book and tucked it under his arm before running to catch up to Jack and Dave, who followed Arthur out into the yard. They were just in time to see Arthur disappear around the corner of the house, heading towards the street. "Oh, fuck," Dave and Jack said in unison and hurried to follow. Arthur, his strides so long and quick the boys had to run to catch up, made it to the road, and turned to face a battered Chevy sedan bearing down on him. The driver stood on the brakes to keep from hitting the massive man, and managed to stop just inches from Arthur. A balding man in a polo shirt opened the door, set one foot on the ground, and stepped halfway out of the car. "What the fuck is wrong with you, jackass? How about you take that stupid fucking costume and get the fuck out of the road?" Arthur raised his sword and shouted, "Battle!" The force of his voice made the balding man stagger back, which probably saved him from being maimed as Arthur brought Excalibur down in a sweeping arc that chopped through the hood of the car and knocked the engine off its mounts. The car gave a belching cough as it was thrown half a dozen feet sideways and promptly caught on fire. "Oh, fuck," all the three boys said together. Arthur reached down and grabbed the front bumper of the car with one hand, and with hardly any effort, tossed it over onto its side. He gave out a jaunty, "Aha!" as the flaming wreck crashed out of his way. Swinging his sword, whooshing through the air, he walked past the burning ruin and continued down the street. The balding man with his cell phone in his hand was screaming into it. "I need the police! A lunatic with a sword just chopped my car in half!" "Uh-oh," Dave said. "What do we do now?" Tim asked. He wasn't wringing his hands, but he gripped the leather book so hard he was shaking. "Fuck," Jack said, looking up and down the street. "We need to get Regan. Tim, you come with me. Dave, do you have your phone on you?" Dave patted his front pocket and nodded. "Keep Arthur in sight. We'll call you." Arthur was already almost a block away, beating the shit out of a delivery van that had the bad fortune to drive down the street, while the driver bailed at the passenger side door and ran away screaming. Lowering his head, Dave ran towards him. Jack and Tim exchanged a quick glance, then ran in the other direction. John Regan, who insisted the boys refer to him as Master Regan, lived about 2 blocks away, in a neat one-story house. He told his neighbors that he worked in stocks, but the actual currency he dealt in was magic. He had a select clientele that paid him extremely handsomely for small magic. A great deal of those small magics were centered around erectile dysfunction, but occasionally there was something worth the time of a master wizard. As he thought more and more about retirement, he sought out his 3 young apprentices to follow in his footsteps and keep the cash flow for boner function going. Once they were fully trained, he planned on retiring somewhere sunny while they filled his bank account with portions of their magical earnings. He thought his life was very good indeed until he heard a pounding on the door and opened it to see Tim and Jack standing there with worried expressions on their faces. His already sinking gut sank further when he saw that Tim was holding one of his most precious books. "What did you do?" he asked, knowing he wouldn't like the answer. The 2 boys exchanged glances. Tim swallowed hard and wrung his hands on the book like he might be trying to tear it in half. With a snarl, Regan reached out and snatched it from his clammy grip. Jack said. Tim said. "For Christ's sake, just spit it out," Regan shouted. "We summoned something," Jack said. Regan took in a deep breath and ran his hand over his dark, slicked-back hair and focused all his will to keep his voice even. "And what, pray tell, did you summon?" The boys exchanged another glance. "We summoned King Arthur," Tim said. "And we think he's insane," Jack said. "By all the gods," Regan said through clenched teeth. "Where is he?" The 2 boys pointed down the street where Regan could hear sirens. He turned and grabbed his cloak off the coat hook by the door. "Show me." The 2 boys turned to run in the direction of the sirens, and Regan followed. As they ran, Jack called Dave. "Where is he?" he asked when his friend answered. "We're in the park," Dave said through the phone, "and he just chopped down a tree." He paused. "Make that 2 trees." Jack veered right between houses and checked over his shoulder to make sure Tim and Regan were still behind him. Arthur was easy to find, as the passive destruction in his wake was profound. Crashed police cars, dazed emergency workers, even a fire truck that had been flipped on its side, all gave evidence of his passing. He was currently being slowed, however, as he decided to take on a bronze statue of the town's founder, who proved to be made of sterner stuff than the bald guy's Chevrolet. "By the blood of the gods," Regan said as when he saw Arthur. "We don't know what happened," Dave said. "He came out insane." "Of course he's insane, you idiots," Regan roared. "You summoned a mythical figure. Someone who never actually existed. It's not as though there was a real King Arthur with a memory and reason to draw on. You summoned a fucking character from a book." The boys exchanged another worried glance and lowered their heads. "Wait," Regan said, lifting his finger to point at them. "What did you use for a source of the summoning?" As quickly as they could, the 3 boys told him, and, very reluctantly, mentioned the big drop of Jack's blood. "You used blood magic?" Regan gripped his carefully styled hair, making it stand up from his head. "You took a bunch of different novels and then used fucking blood magic?" He turned and screamed to the sky, one hand gripping his hair while the other shaking the book of magic. He turned back, pointing again. "If we survive this, remind me to kill you. All of you." Tim was near tears, and Dave was as pale as a ghost. "But what do we do?" Jack asked. "If you use blood magic," Regan said, "the only way to stop him is to get your blood back." "How do we do that?" Jack asked. "You have to reclaim your blood from..." Regan gestured towards the Mad King who managed to decapitate the statue. That thing. "Refer to my previous question," Jack said. "We need a reclamation spell. better known as a thieving cantrip, but we need to give it a little extra horsepower. Regan opened the book and began riffling through the pages. I've never tried it for something like this before, but I've never had a group of apprentices who were quite so fucking stupid. He scanned the pages, muttering and nodding to himself. Okay, I think this will, hopefully, work. But I need a couple of things. He glanced around and then pointed at a convenience store attached to a gas station. Tim, run down there and get me something sticky. The boy held his hands up in a questioning gesture. Flour and water, pre-made cookie dough, a wad of chewing gum. Just whatever we can stick to his armor. Nodding, Tim sprinted across the park. You, Regan pointed at Dave, distract him. Make sure he doesn't go too far. I can't cast this if we're running after him. Dave wrinkled his brow in thought for a moment, then nodded around for Arthur, who had tipped the statue off its base and was busily chopping it in half. You, Regan pointed at Jack. No more than 2 steps from me at any time. When Tim returns, I will need your blood. Swallowing thickly, Jack nodded. Dave skidded to a stop beside Arthur. As he ran towards him, he'd been thinking madly about what he could say to an insane apparition who was little more than a violent figment of someone's imagination. He'd been reading Arthurian stories since he was old enough to read, which is where he got the idea to try and bring the king to life and settle the wrongs of the world, and he thought he had an idea of what would get the giant's attention. "My Lord King!" Dave shouted as he leapt onto the now vacant base for the statue. "My Lord King! For Avalon!" He thrust his fist in the air as he said it. Arthur stopped chopping at the statue and looked up at him. He raised his sword in the air. "For Avalon!" he bellowed. "For Guinevere!" Dave hollered. "For Guinevere!" Arthur echoed. "For Camelot!" Dave screeched, his voice cracking. "For Camelot!" Arthur thundered, and the sound ripping at the inside of Dave's ears. "Now!" Dave shouted, pointing. "To battle!" He pointed behind him into a grove of oak trees. In the center of a circular grove stood a marble mausoleum, where the founding father of the town, whose statue Arthur had just destroyed, was interred. Dave felt a little guilty, disturbing the dead. But it would take even Arthur a while to knock it down. The Mad King followed Dave's pointing finger, raised his sword ever higher, and bellowed, "To battle!" The ground shook as he charged across the open grass towards the marble structure. "That ought to hold you, you mad fuck," Dave said, and turned to run back towards Regan. Tim had rejoined Regan and Jack, a tube of Pillsbury dough in his hand. Behind him, a plumply-faced store clerk was holding his phone and shouting, "I'm calling the police!" When Regan glared at him, Tim shrugged. "I don't have any money." Regan snatched the tube from his hand. "We'll deal with everything later." He gave the tube a sharp twist and it popped open. He grabbed a handful of the dough and began working it in his fingers, turning it into a sticky mass. He glanced at Jack. "Now, I need a drop of your blood." Jack held out his finger and looked at Dave. "Where's your knife?" Dave patted his pockets. "I must have dropped it." With a cry of frustration, Tim grabbed Jack's finger and bit it, hard. Jack snatched his finger out of Tim's mouth and it came away bloody. "What did you do that for?" Jack asked, a wounded look on his face. "We don't have time to fuck around," Tim said. Regan looked at Tim, obviously impressed. "You're a bit of a vicious little bastard, aren't you, Tim?" Tim shrugged and Regan nodded with approval. "I like it." Reaching out, Regan grabbed Jack's finger and smeared a line of blood across the mass of dough in his other hand. He worked it in his fist for a moment, then picked up the book and held the dough over his head. He read from the book, the words strange and stirring in the ears of the boys, even though they were familiar with the language of magic. Their hair stood on end, and their insides tingled as John Regan brought his significant power to bear. The dough in his fist began giving off a red glow. Regan held out the mass of dough to Dave. "Can you throw this and get it to stick to his armor?" Dave took the dough. "I'll sure should give it a try," he said and took off towards Arthur. Arthur was busy smashing the mausoleum into little pieces, and Dave was sorry to see at least one shattered coffin with a skeletal limb poking into the open air. "I'm totally going to hell for this," he muttered as he got close. The Mad King paid him no mind as Dave threw the dough at him. His aim was true, and the dough smacked against his armor with a damp thud. "Battle!" Arthur shouted as he pushed over another pillar. "Come away, Dave," Regan said as he jogged closer. "All of you boys, stand behind me." They did as they were bidden, cowering in their master's shadow, while Regan set the book on the grass before him and raised both hands in the air. He shouted words of power, and the air crackled with energy. The glowing dough on Arthur's back gave off a blaze of red light, and the Mad King finally paused in his destruction to look back towards Regan. His voice reached a booming shout that rivaled even Arthur. Regan made a throwing gesture with both hands. The mass of dough flew off Arthur and seemed to pull something away from him. A bright white light flared in the middle of Arthur's chest. The light threw off intense heat and was too brilliant to look at. Thrusting his arms in the air, his sword aloft, Arthur opened his mouth to shout, but the sound was cut off with a thunderous boom. Regan threw his hands across his eyes and managed to keep his feet, but the boys were all tossed to the ground. When they opened their eyes, Arthur was gone. In the place he was standing was nothing but a charred crater. There were sirens fast approaching, and Regan bent down to help the boys stand. "There is only one thing left to do," Regan said, looking at each of his apprentices. "What?" they said in unison. "Get the fuck out of here," Regan said, and took off in the direction of his house. Glancing at each other, the boys turned and followed. The end. If you are enjoying my videos, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, because it would help me out a lot, and I'd really appreciate it. But if not, I appreciate you being here with me. Thanks very much.